What's this? Jimmy Aubrey. God. Let's come to this. Brownell gets Napoleon, I get Jimmy Aubrey. Well, right, come on, Richard, 20 minutes and we'll be down to the pub. Here's a comedian who probably deserved to work for the Weiss brothers. Jimmy Aubrey, maybe not the most famous name that we've seen on this set, but look at this lifespan. Born October 23rd, 1887, died September 2nd, 1983 at the Motion Picture Home in Woodland Hills. Long life. Jimmy Aubrey outlived almost all of his contemporaries, and that may have been surviving on pure orneriness. We're not sure, but Aubrey apparently was one of the more unpleasant off-screen of the comedians. And hey, let's face it, most comedians aren't that easy to get along. But nevertheless, he was a reasonably popular mid-level comedy star in the early 20s, but unfortunately his personality and his interaction with his fellow comedians and film producers ended him up at the Weiss brothers by the end of the silent era. Now, Aubrey was British, born in Liverpool, England, and came to America as many of his contemporaries did, with the Fred Carno troupe of educated comedians who came over with Chaplin and Stan Laurel. In fact, played and created a character called the Terrible Turk, which was a bad wrestler in the famous Carno sketch Mumming Birds, also known as Night, in an English music hall. Aubrey came to films in 1915 when he was half of the comedy team of Heine and Louie, working with Walter Kendig in the Starlight comedies for the Mittenthal Film Company. Those were released through Pathé. And these comedies, I guess, were reasonably popular. Mittenthal lasted about a year and a half, and then Aubrey found himself working elsewhere. But it was a good auspicious debut. After Mittenthal went under, Aubrey found himself working for Vitagraph in 1916. As a supporting comedian, he was appearing in some of the Huey Mack comedies directed by Larry Seaman, soon to be a film comedian himself. You can see him in one surviving one, Hash and Havoc, playing a crazed customer. Aubrey's definitely has a very flamboyant sort of style. He always reminds me a little bit of Sid Caesar, actually, in the way he works, or even Mel Brooks. But anyway, he continued to work in support for Vitagraph for a while, although he did move over to the Smallwood Film Company in 1917 and made some pictures there for that short-lived company, and then found himself back at Vitagraph. Now here's Al Thompson playing the owner of the lunch cart. Al Thompson, here's a mainstay at Educational Pictures in the 20s. Supporting comic, worked with all of the education. Actually worked with Larry Seaman before that. He was at Vitagraph working with Larry Seaman about 1920. And in the mid-20s, when Seaman left Vitagraph, he moved over to Educational, worked in mermaid comedies, worked basically for all of Jack White's units. You can see him in the Lloyd Hamiltons, Lupino Lanes, worked with Lige Connolly, Al St. John. And then you see Thompson working in the 30s at Columbia, again, as both a stuntman and a comedian. Oh, here's a bit of classic Weiss brother borrowing, the Runaway Cherry gag, which was lifted from a couple of Laurel and Hardy pictures, Second 100 Years and From Soup to Nuts, 1928. But anyway, Thompson, like I said, you see working with the Three Stooges, Charlie Chase, Harry Langdon, Buster Keaton, Columbia in the 30s and 40s. He doubled a number of comedians, including Harry Langdon and frequently Andy Clyde. In fact, I think in one Andy Clyde comedy he plays Andy's brother. But good solid supporting comedian. Anyway, getting back to Aubrey, I guess we have to. He became a star comedian in 1918 when Larry Seaman took the East Coast Vitagraph Comedy Company. Basically, Seaman had become a star by this point and was put in charge of Vitagraph's comedy product. He moved the unit out to the West Coast, starting several new series. He started a comedy series starring Earl Montgomery and Joe Rock, who had been working in the Big V Riot Squad, the Vitagraph group of stuntmen that worked with Seaman. And he started a series with Jimmy Aubrey. And Aubrey was sort of the third comic on the totem pole. His comedies were the lowest budgeted of the group, but they were, you know, they were making enough money. I think they were budgeted about $10,000 a short, which compared to what Larry Seaman was spending was nothing. But they still, they still managed to be reasonably popular. And all the comedies that Vitagraph were putting out at this point had titles that were blank and blank, like Scamps and Scalawags, Tough Lucks and Tin Lizzies, Bathing Beauties and Big Boobs. Believe it, they actually got away with that. Now, Aubrey was, like I said, as a comedian, apart from this, from a sometimes flamboyant style, sometimes not. Sometimes it's odd. The surviving Vitagraph comedies of his, some of them he doesn't do anything except sort of get abused by everybody. But what Aubrey had going for him, was his supporting Heavy, who played the villain in a lot of his pictures, who was none other than Oliver Hardy. Babe Hardy had come to Vitagraph after working with Billy West, who of course produced the Hairbreadth Harry comedies, and he's starting to notice that everybody in the comedy industry knows everybody else. Everybody worked with somebody somewhere. But Hardy had been working at King B with Billy West until that company folded. Hardy had then been freelancing at comedy studios like LKO until he was picked up to support Jimmy Aubrey. The director of Aubrey's first Vitagraph comedies was a comedy director by the name of J.A. Howe. Vitagraph was actually playing up Aubrey, Hardy, and Howe as the terrible trio, which I think probably miffed Aubrey a little bit, at least considering his ego and general eccentricities. This was the kind of strangeness he did. He, in all of his contracts, he demanded to be paid only in gold. He did not want to be paid in cash. Didn't trust the American dollar somehow. Apparently, again, he fought with J.A. Howe, who soon left the series because he was tired of dealing with Aubrey. He also fought with Noel Mason Smith, the director who came in to replace Howe. And basically, everybody was having difficulty working with Aubrey. Noel Mason Smith left, I think, the series at the end of the first year. And then another fine comedy director, Jess Robbins, who had worked at S&A, directed a lot of the comedians of the teens and 20s that came in, started directing the Aubreys. Then Aubrey decided he didn't like Oliver Hardy. Now, Oliver Hardy was one of the nicest people in Hollywood. I mean, very easy to work with. Maybe a little bit of a scene stealer sometimes, which I'm sure Aubrey didn't like. But, I mean, everybody always had nice things to say about Babe Hardy, except apparently for Jimmy Aubrey. And Aubrey wanted Hardy dumped, but Jess Robbins managed to argue with Aubrey and convince him that maybe it was a good idea to have somebody that good working with you. And so Hardy stayed on for the second season of the Aubrey comedies of Vitagraph. Now, Aubrey's character at Vitagraph looks a lot different. He wears this mustache which looks kind of like trained nose hairs. I mean, it just sort of sticks to like chunks of mustache that seem to sort of stick out of his nose. Like I said, sometimes, and it's not to say that Aubrey can't be funny from time to time. He does like have this sort of, like I said, sometimes flamboyant sort of, again, you're sort of the terrible Turk probably. working for him. But in some of his pictures, it looks almost like he's mad at the director and he's not going to do anything. You know, he's just going to stand there and let other people get the laughs. A lot of Aubrey's Vitagraphs no longer survive, but some of the ones that do, and the best example is one called His Jonah Day, which is just dreadful. And he just, again, doesn't really do a heck of a lot. And he doesn't have all the money to do the big expensive sight gags like Larry Seaman was doing. Another problem Aubrey had at the time was the same problem that Stan Laurel had, and a lot of light blue-eyed actors had in motion pictures in the early 20s, was light blue eyes photographed on monochromatic film as white. I mean, if you look at Aubrey's eyes here, his, you know, the irises almost disappear. But this was dealt with heavy eyeliner, which made him look even weirder. That's the interesting thing, actually, in the Weiss brother comedies, where now he's gotten rid of the weird makeup and he looks a bit normal. He's actually funnier in these films than he is in a lot of his Vitagraph pictures, at least the ones that survive. So, you know, in some ways, working for the Weiss brothers is probably a good thing for him. In 1921, Aubrey renegotiated his contract with Vitagraph. He fired Oliver Hardy and Jess Robbins and decided he was going to direct himself. Well, as the story frequently goes, that turned out not to be a great idea. And his firing of Oliver Hardy did nothing but basically promote Oliver Hardy, because Larry Seaman said, well, hey, if Aubrey doesn't want him, I'll take him. Larry Seaman grabbed him, and Hardy became Seaman's supporting comic. And at the time, Larry Seaman was basically as popular as Chaplin. Sadly, that didn't last, and Seaman's career ended up being a bit tragic. But in any event, you know, at the time it was a good move. And Hardy got a lot of attention working with Seaman. Aubrey's attempts to direct himself were basically a disaster. He got through about 3 films when Vitagraph said, no, this isn't working, and put him back under the control of other directors. But again, I think by that point, Vitagraph was already having financial problems thanks to Larry Seaman overspending on his comedies. Aubrey's weren't lighting any fires with exhibitors by this point. I think they were getting tired of the fact that he really didn't do anything, and his mustache looked weird. And so by the end of the 3rd season, Aubrey was looking for another studio. And he ended up where Larry Seaman ended up first, at Chadwick, which was an independent company that had been formed by producer I.E. Chadwick and Larry Seaman to make pictures. He didn't last there very long. I think about a year, and then found himself being starred in a series produced by Joe Rock of the same Montgomery and Rock, who had been teamed at Vitagraph. Rock produced comedies with Aubrey for a number of years, I think about 2 or 3, and I guess had some amount of success with Aubrey. Almost no Aubrey comedies produced by Joe Rock survive today. There's rumor that Oliver Hardy again was working with Aubrey in some of them, because Oliver Hardy was working with Aubrey. Was working with Joe Rock from time to time. In fact, Stan Laurel was working for Joe Rock too. And Anita Garvin said she remembered Laurel directing some of the Jimmy Aubrey comedies. So after Joe Rock, basically, I think, wrapped up the Aubrey series in like 26. Aubrey again, out of work. Where does he end up? The Weiss brothers. I think finally Aubrey's difficultness had gotten the better of him, and this was really where, you know, the only place he could find employment, the only place he could work. But at least, again, by this point, he had dropped the mustache. And in typical Weiss fashion, these comedies are not brilliant. Again, we're borrowing a lot of gags. In fact, Alibi Alley, one of the other ones on our set, is a complete remake of a Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, a supporting role in a picture called Love 'Em and Weep that Hal Roach made in 27. You also saw Jimmy Aubrey, of course, playing Rudolph in the later Weiss brother produced Hairbreadth Harry comedy. So he was working where he could, and the Weisses were giving him, as much work as they could. After that, Aubrey's starring career was pretty much over. He was kind of depending on friends for a while, who, even though he wasn't always saying nice things about him, they seemed to stand by him. Larry Seaman put him in what ended up being Larry Seaman's last picture, the 1928 A Simple Sap. Oliver Hardy found him work in some of the Laurel and Hardy comedies. He plays a drunk in a great 1929 Laurel and Hardy comedy called That's My Wife. He ended up, when talkies came in, he ended up working places like Path A, where he actually stars in at least one comedy that survives with Al St. John. But he was on his way into working in bit parts. But again, as in the same way that he outlived his contemporaries, what actually happened was Jimmy Aubrey became one of the more busy bit players working. He became a contract player at the 20th Century Fox in the late 30s after doing comedy relief in a number of B-westerns, including working comedy relief in some of the B-westerns starring Fred Scott that had been produced by Stan Laurel in the late 30s. And literally, like I said, from the late 30s really until the mid-50s, Jimmy Aubrey pops up in tons of stuff. Oh, we got a pie fight going here. All right, well, that's always a good comedy standard. But Aubrey again. There were a number of comics, silent comics in the 20s, who became like anytime that a movie was set in Britain or needed a Cockney character, you'd get Jimmy Aubrey or Billy Bevan or Clyde Cook, which is ironic because Clyde Cook and Billy Bevan were both actually Australian. But they seemed to play a lot of Cockneys. Aubrey would play drunks and a lot of things. In fact, literally, last night I recorded this, Jimmy Aubrey popped up in Mr. Moto Takes a Vacation, 1939, with Peter Lorre doing a drunk. Had a nice bit in that. So, again, Aubrey made a decent living, doing bit parts in scores. I mean, literally hundreds of movies. Again, his credits go into the 50s. I think his last known credit is Abbott and Costello meets Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But then you see him in television after that. And again, he lived into the 1980s. He was living out at the motion picture home. He was out there for about 20 years. And once in a while would give an interview or two, usually saying some somewhat controversial and nasty things. He didn't like either Laurel or Hardy. They both owed him money, those bastards. You know, he would say that. And Joe Rock he didn't like. Joe Rock was a crook. And, in fact, the only person he had nice things to say about was Jess Robbins, his director at Vitagraph. He's a nice director, nice man. That was, good fella. Well, not sure why, but he seemed to like him. Again, I think sheer orneriness got him through life. He proudly boasted that he lived to this ripe old age because he neither smoked nor drank. But you see a lot of pictures of him chomping on a big cigar, out at the at the home. So, again, just a general contrarian, I think is what you could really say about him. But well, what the heck, I guess he deserves his own little niche or comment. I guess we have to keep smiling, as he says in this picture. But that's Jimmy Aubrey. What can you do? Is this thing over yet? I think we're getting there. And again, like in many Jimmy Aubrey pictures, it ends up with everybody beating on him. Well, couldn't happen to a nicer guy.